I have heard criticism about the conflict in the Middle East, myself from members that I have worked with, and these numbers seem to suggest in a wider amount the overall dissatisfaction with our nation's role. It is my belief that this role is not in line with the core beliefs of Canadians, nor the majority of sailors, soldiers, airmen, and airwomen of the Canadian Forces who must hold their tongues while serving in keeping with the National Defence Act. As the Conservative government continues to bring us closer day by day to the American agenda and priorities in the Middle East, we can now see in some form how this has radically changed Canadian foreign policy in a very dangerous direction. I would use an example, the new relationship we seem to be mirroring in Pakistan, a military dictatorship interested in our nuclear knowledge and a dubious violator of human rights. As Prime Minister Stephen Harper leads our country in a dangerous and costly direction, we must consider what will result from his poor decisions in regards to our global security. Under his authority, we have strayed in under a year from the very values that the majority of Canadians hold dear. I also wish to bring an understanding to members of the forces who continue to serve in Afghanistan and throughout the world that they do not need to support this continued misuse of our armed forces. The establishment of priorities by Stephen Harper based on war-making and direct military confrontation, as used by the U.S., is, I believe, not in the best interest of Canadians, nor in the best interest, most importantly, of Afghans. We are beginning to see how this direct mode of confrontation espoused by our military leaders is radicalizing and unifying the peoples of southern Afghanistan. Southern Afghans are identifying with Taliban groups and unifying with them against the international community. As the days pass and the suicide bombings grow, we can see evidence of this feeling. As in Iraq, where the U.S. entered with its stated goals of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction, we so too entered Afghanistan. We can all see, of course, the change in nature that the resulting combat affected in Iraq. The population was radicalized against the Western agents, and the theater of operations quickly devolved into brutal civil and sectarian violence. It is my supposition that we are accepting the American model of conflict management and using failed geopolitical tools that have more to do with U.S. hegemony in the Middle East than the long-term health and safety of the Afghan people. And by extension, of course, the security and rights of citizens right here in Canada. The use of direct military confrontation in Iraq has turned the insurgency into a strong force capable of challenging the U.S. military, and al-Qaeda into a global movement from a loose network of affiliated groups. And yet, we are repeating the mistakes and watching the growing strength and tenacity of the Taliban. It is very important, I feel, to begin analyzing some of the terminology and resulting simplification in our understanding of the mission. Perhaps we should begin asking ourselves, who exactly are the Taliban? Just who are they? And are we content with just calling them the enemy, the Taliban? And should we be content as Canadians for a moment with the terms produced by the Harper government and the Prime Minister's office? If we are to properly appreciate the nature of the conflict, we must be honest with ourselves as to the makeup of the quote-unquote enemy and the historical realities involved. The people of southern Afghanistan saw the Western militaries arrive after 9/11 and ally themselves with the Northern Alliance, a group as criminal and as murderous as the Taliban, instantly choosing sides in ethnic and tribal conflicts. If we are to effect and assist in true long-term change in Afghanistan, we must acknowledge the many errors in our current modes of conducting this mission. I fear, however, that the current government of Stephen Harper and the Conservatives will be unwilling to acknowledge many of the Afghan realities and instead continue to support U.S. foreign policy over what should be the true focus of this mission, the Afghan people. With a minimum of debate in the House of Commons and against the better judgment of a number of generals, we have entered into this conflict and now find ourselves spiraling into a growing morass as the region unifies against Western intervention. Minister of Defense Gordon O'Connor said yesterday that if we leave now, the Taliban, quote-unquote, could take over again. I would blame this situation directly on the way we have decided to engage the people of southern Afghanistan. directly hitting them and giving the poor and isolated in the southern region more reason to unify against us. Perhaps it is too late. By encouraging a proper discussion and debate within Canada, Stephen Harper could have mitigated many mistakes. If he had truly been concerned about the people of Afghanistan and not been dedicated primarily to supporting the American administration's plans in the Middle East, we might have seen a much different result. Many of the requirements that the commanders of Canada's armed forces confront today are not those that their predecessors faced at the eve of World War II, or even in the Cold War. The establishment of a rights-driven society by way of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms has given our society guarantees that have been proudly taken out to the world in our foreign policy. And in a democratic society, to whose civilian masters the military owes its loyalty, the military leadership must, of course, embody and carry out effectively the policies and will of our society. By saying this, I would suggest that our form of direct military confrontation against the peoples of southern Afghanistan is out of step with our national will and traditional role as facilitators of peace. And that the country's ethical compass needs to be realigned to its previous position. We have missed the opportunity to assist in United Nations missions in Lebanon and Darfur. Our silence during the war in southern Lebanon is also reprehensible and completely ignored our country's historical role in the region, one for which a Canadian won the Nobel Peace Prize. And for these reasons, I myself could no longer be a part of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I made a difficult decision one morning. By not engaging in a proper debate and effective discussion broadly across our country and in the House of Commons, we have not given this permission to our federal government or our military, and they have acted against our nature as a nation. Questions must be asked if we are to participate with the United States on matters such as the sanctioned use of torture and the unrepentant annihilation of civilian populations. We must also examine as a country the way we are funding our mission in Afghanistan and why we are dedicating 90% of the operational budget into war making and only 10% to development and humanitarian assistance. As well, we must examine the connection to aid deliverance and how we are allowing assistance to be given only to those who accept our military objectives. Such instances turn aid into a weapon of war and the tool of the occupier, further dividing the population. And that is why I chose to take the actions this summer of resigning from the Canadian Armed Forces. I did not feel that there had been enough discussion, and the narrow and controlled discussion by the Conservatives did not fully appreciate Canadian public opinion, nor the complexities of the Afghan reality. I felt it was necessary to broaden the debate in whatever way I could and be part of the essential discussion that needs to occur. As the war in Lebanon continued to escalate, and the Prime Minister threw our support behind Israel instead of being an impartial securer of peaceful options, I wondered how this new path of conservative policy would end. And all members of the CF, the Canadian Forces, must have scratched their heads collectively as the Prime Minister lent his support while a major in our armed forces died in a UN observation post, fulfilling our historic role as intermediaries. All while the PM said nothing and allowed the conflict to grow. In summation, I encourage everyone here to broaden, as often and as vigorously as possible, the debate about our role in Afghanistan and the Middle East. To persist in questioning our cooperation with the United States and to continue supporting the men and women who selflessly serve our country. They need a population willing to be vocal and unrelenting in its opposition to the war, and uncompromising in its call for peace and adherence to international law. And I join with many others, I'm sure, in saying, support our troops and bring them home.